My presentation will be made of two different parts today. Although we are kind of started with a very short introduction of what I'm doing, I want to talk a little bit, about less than 10 minutes, about my overall project. Then, and this might sound a bit theoretical, some might even call it a bit abstract. So in order to make those ideas a bit more concrete, in the second part and the major part of my presentation, I'm going to present a specific part of my project and try to put some of those theoretical ideas, show some of those theoretical ideas in the flesh.
Just to stop you for 1 minute, I forgot to say that Kutlu's sponsor is Professor Meisha Mosenson, and she's sitting right here.
All right, so I start with the overall project. The soul, that is psyche, anima, or ruh, is an elusive word with a peculiar genealogy. Defined as the very essence of life by the ancient Greek and Roman traditions and the breath of life later by the Islamic tradition, the concept was reformulated and conceptualized anew over the last 2 centuries by the modern disciplines of psychiatry and psychology. Both disciplines invested their utmost energy to reify the soul and to physiologically configure its constitution. Despite the long and arduous efforts, nonetheless, the connection between the psyche and brain could never emerge as an unshakable truth. The futile attempts and processes of empirically proving or scientifically articulating what the soul is, however, seem to have opened the door to further contestations, clash of competing disciplines and discourses, leaving us with intricate configurations as well as fluctuating sets of truth about the soul, its connection to the brain, selfhood, sexuality, and health in general. My project, or rather my book project, which I am kind of planning to work here as a postdoctoral fellow, focuses on the ways in which this set of transformations and contestations over the issue of the soul came about within the culturally Islamic, yet radically secular context of the early Republic of Turkey. Concurrently, the project examines the epistemological and conceptual formation of issues related to soul, such as madness, sexuality, and selfhood, as they came to unfold within the context of imagined Turkish nation between the period from the establishment of the Republic, that is 1924, to the coup d'etat of 1960. As you can imagine, the project is predicated on an interdisciplinary approach that utilizes different bodies of knowledge, including but not limited to the intellectual history of Turkey, history and philosophy of science, and historical anthropology. Borrowing from analytical philosophers such as Ian Hacking, Anna Davidson, and others, the project engages with the present debates in these fields via a critical evaluation of the human sciences, particularly psychiatry and psychology, their efficacy as a tool of governance, and their effect in creating a new nation and new subjectivities. The study specifically traces the works of a number of scientists who systematically produced knowledge on issues such as the soul, mental illness, and healthy subjectivity in the early and post-war Turkey. The first and foremost among them is the psychiatrist Masar Osman, who is widely acknowledged as the father of Turkish psychiatry. As a major state expert and a leading public intellectual, Osman produced and promulgated knowledge that complemented the Kemalist project of modern state building in Turkey. In addition to Osman, my project examines the works and careers of a number of his disciples. Special attention is also given to figures who produced alternative approaches to Osman's official, that is, biological psychiatry, and among them is the psychoanalyst Izzettin Şadan, terrible photo, I'm not blocking it, on whom I'm going to talk today, and the neo-spiritualist Bedri Ruhselman. An analysis of these experts and their different views on what it means to be mentally healthy, productive subject, I contend sheds ample light on the convoluted relations between the sciences and the formation of the early republic in Turkey. It also discloses the particular characteristics of an overly zealous secular state, which, while consciously severed all ties with its Islamic past, had unconsciously continued an almost imperceptible conversation with structures and categories inherited from this past. Put differently, I argue that the overtly secular nation state of Turkey has been continuously haunted by its past, or rather by shadows from the past that were not necessarily discernible even to its controlling and regulatory gaze. My project emphasizes the importance of recognizing and evaluating these experts and their often clashing approaches to madness and Turkish psychiatry as products of their own times, as well as the ambiguities and contradictions of their eras. One cannot ignore, for example, the ways in which the modernizing project of the Kemalist era opened new opportunities and spaces for the production of a new officially endorsed scientific language and discourse. It engendered, at the same time, myriad forms of knowledge of the soul and psyche that partially challenged or else resisted the early Republican vision of an ultra-secular, ultra-nationalist project of Europeanization. As I argue in my project, these experts have contributed differently to the translation of the project of modernity in Turkey, with a particular emphasis on the engineering of mentally healthy and normative Turkish subjects. Following, the future carriers and knowledge production of their disciples furthermore displays the epistemological contingencies rather than the linearity expected of authorized psychoscientific discourses. Furthermore, by questioning the binarism of the secular and religious, my study focuses on the processes of the secularization of subjectivities, as well as the replacement of Islamic discourses in defining the normative in society. This intervention involved as well the redefinition of Islamic beliefs and practices on madness and sexuality as non-rational and non-modern, and therefore harmful to modern subjects. And this is a process, I argue, that involved the scientific discourses redefining themselves through their opposites, that is, religion. Put differently, my project does not take for granted psychiatry or any other sciences and their practices as given or progressive, but rather as a part of a historical process that bound those discourses to enter into multi-layered relations and conversations with all the forms and practices, including religion and religious traditions. So that's kind of, my project in a nutshell. And now I am moving to the second part of my presentation, which is going to be about the emergence of psychoanalytic discourse in early Republican Turkey. So focusing on the emergence of psychoanalytic discourse in Turkey, in this part of my presentation, I will focus on how psychoanalysis was culturally translated and transformed into Turkish within the context and problem spaces of the early Republic. To do so, I'll address the work of İzzettin Şadan, let's go back to that terrible picture, a psychiatrist and initiator of psychoanalysis in Turkey. Attempting to promote and disseminate psychoanalytic knowledge in Turkey, Şadan went beyond the clinical practice of psychiatry and aimed to analytically engage with what he called the collective Turkish psyche through his psychoanalytic writings. In other words, he employed a psychoanalytic methodology to participate in, as well as to analyze, modern Turkish public concerns, including questions and discussions regarding the formation of the modern and healthy Turkish population within the aspirational framework of the early republic. While focusing on Şadan's translation of psychoanalysis and its promotion and dissemination of it in Turkey, it should be reiterated that the importation and transplantation of a discourse and set of practices from one sociocultural setting to another is never a one-dimensional project. Put differently, by translation, I do not mean a word-for-word rendition between different languages, but rather a conversation that involved a process of interpretation and cross-configuration between different cultures, contexts, and traditions. So rather than being an evolution of the original, translation is here considered with a focus on how the original and the translation complemented each other to produce meanings larger than mere copies or reproductions. The emphasis, therefore, is on how the psychoanalytic discourse passed through the socio-political filters of early Republican society while being translated into Turkish. The process involved the transformation and rearticulation of psychoanalytic forms to accommodate the Turkish context, as well as the redefinition and reconstitution of the Turkish society in accordance with a psychoanalytic interpretation of itself. In other words, the psychoanalytic knowledge passed through the lenses of its local interpreters, as in our case it's Şadan, whose inclinations and subjectivities were constituted by their own locality, as well as temporality and its conditions of possibilities. A consideration of this transformative process is central to my argument, since it discloses the processes through which a different translatable psychoanalytic discourse emerged via Şadan's engagement with the perceived problems confronting the early Republican society, including that of the role of religion and the historic origins of the modern Turkish nation. My talk today will also explore the ways in which Şadan's psychoanalytic translations and articulations posed a challenge to Freudian psychoanalysis by questioning its universality through a problematization of Freud's concepts of love and sexuality. And those concepts, according to Şadan, did not correspond with the dynamics of Turkey, as we will see. So, in what follows, I'll address Şadan's attempt at the Turkification, what I call the Turkification of psychoanalysis, a process of translation which includes a resistance to and a break from some features of Freud's psychoanalytic interpretations of the self, society, civilization, the sex drive, and neuroses as they unfolded within a Western context. In order to do so, I'm going to delve into what I call Şadanian psychoanalysis and discuss a series of Şadan's writings on love, eros, through which I believe we can trace his conceptualizations of psyche, science, biology, and religion, among other things, more clearly. Although using Freudian psychoanalysis as his analytical framework in this series of writings, Şadan explicitly breaks away from Freud's formulation and compliance with the idea of libido as eros. Differently from Freud's Judeo-Christian notion of love, or eros, Şadan's notion of love as inseparable from sexual pleasure and the sex drive is by and large, consciously or unconsciously, predicated on a Sunni Islamic tradition, predicated on the Sunni Islamic tradition and its discourse on sexuality. Thus, for Şadan, who never married, who pursued bourgeois conjugal family relations as Freud did, it was time to raise awareness about this sickness of love and save people from the tyranny and molestation of it. While not targeting the sex drive or the libido directly, Şadan nonetheless considers pure desexualized or romantic love, that is eros, the Freudian canon, to be an abstract microbe which constitutes a sickness like cancer, tuberculosis, and pneumonia, only a lighter one. Even though even though to Chardin, the sex drive can be, without a doubt, dissocial and treacherous, nonetheless it is a drive embedded in human nature and cannot be disposed of. But to Chardin, love in the Freudian sense, detached from sex and pleasure, is a notion that is primarily, that's primarily the outcome of Catholicism, which itself is an overgrown child of Judaism. It is a product of the beardless, skirted, and impotent priests of Jesus, whose own sex life could not go beyond crying on the lap of Mary Magdalena, unquote. In his condemnation of romantic forms of modern Western marriage and love, Chardin concludes that the Western concept of love is obviously masochistic, and one embedded in a Christian asceticism that aims to extinguish the sex drive and which in itself is pathological. In another article, Chardin revisits the idea that Christianity trivialized women's sexual drive and consigned men to impotency. In the article, he focuses his criticism on the modern bourgeois idea of conjugal love in marriage, which he characterizes as a form of latent homosexuality. Any man who cannot view a woman as a source of pleasure is ultimately a homosexual, yet one who is unaware of his homosexuality. This is called homosexuality latente. A contemporary concept of marriage, consequently, is simply a homosexual one. And the reason for this is Christianity, which has pushed women away from her sexual world. Think of Virgin Mary for a moment. Mary is none other than a desexualized woman. She appears as a dominant woman that only loves and protects her son. She is the head of her family. The figure of the father does not even exist. The son, Jesus, is simply his mother's pet. He's a weak, timid masochist who preaches to offer your other cheek, then slapped on the cheek, unquote. One might read Chardin's analysis here within the framework of the psychoanalytic discourse that aimed to track down neurotic themes situated within religion, hence on track with Freud's works on the issue. Nevertheless, Chardin clearly comes up with a spin, and he goes beyond Freudian psychoanalysis by stressing the idea that the modern Western conceptualizations of love and marriage appear to be pathological since they are the outcomes of a neurotic Christian understanding of sexuality. They reflect odical themes, hence should be construed psychoanalytically. Chardin furthers his arguments by asserting that Freud's socio-historical analysis of the sex drive is principally valid within the framework of Christian civilization, since, quote, Muslims do not confine the sex drive in such a strict way, unquote. One can see here that Chardin is questioning the universality and scienticity of some notions of Freudian psychoanalysis, with his reading of the Freudian discourse as a set of knowledge and practice based on and emerging from a Judeo-Christian culture that is not universally applicable. This is clearly the point where he's challenging Freud and suggesting the notion that psychoanalysis is bound to be determined by its particular culture and is embedded in its own historical memory rather than being a universal and transhistorical knowledge and practice. Chardin exemplifies this point by pointing to the fact that certain aspects of Freudian psychoanalysis, in particular its definition of eros, is not applicable to Turkey and Turkish society. Freudian understanding of eros simply has its roots in a Judeo-Christian culture and cannot go beyond being a foreign importation for a Turkish society rooted in an Islamic culture. Yet one should still pay attention to the strictly secular language Chardin employs here, which assigns authority to Islamic civilization and culture, but not Islam, the teaching of God, for the definition and formation of sexuality within Islam. When Islam obtains features resembling the masochistic proclivities of Christianity, it becomes masochistic and pathological. Sufism, tasawwuf, constitutes the most significant example most significant example of that, since it displays a strict monasticism and procreates mystical and introverted reactions, such as self-torture and asceticism. Consequently, the sex drive loses its direction and moves from women, its real target, to male lover, to man lover, mahbub, and the drama starts there, unquote. This reference to Sufism needs some deliberation. Apart from the explicit secularized language Şadan uses here, his interpretation of love implicitly predicated on the Sunni Islamic cultural view of sexuality. As it has been convincingly argued, the idea of sexual morality in Islam differs from that of Judaism and Christianity. Islam clearly considers sexual fulfillment of both men and women a major principle, and unlike the Christian perception of legitimate sex, sexual activity is not bound by the procreative purpose in it. Islamic marriage is polygamous and subject to easy termination. Moreover, Islam does not confine sex to marriage. That's only for men, of course, not women. As a psychoanalyst, informed by his own cultural memory, Şadan puts Sufism under and through the gaze of psychoanalysis by concluding that Sufis suffer from paranoia caused by repression of natural worldly desires, particularly including sex, and the conversion of these desires into pathologies similar to that of Christianity. It's clear from his analysis that Sufism is an alien, a foreign importation, bid'ah, and a deviation from mainstream Islam. It is for this reason Şadan maintains, quote, the Sufi is trapped in the mistake of defining the universe through love, or more correctly, through a male lover, unquote. It is within such a framework that Şadan's psychoanalytic evaluation of and resistance to Freudian conceptualizations of eros transforms into a Sunni critique of Sufism formalized within a psychoanalytic language. Those moments of the unfolding of a veiled yet constitutive interaction between the psychoanalytic language and the Sunni Islamic discursive tradition shed light on an intermediate zone, let's call it the arzak, and or a threshold very much in the Al-Ghazalian sense of the modern, and reverberate with what the anthropologist Stefania Pandolfo in a similar context defines as the thin line of modernity. It is on this thin line of modernity, as can be traced through the psychoanalytic perception of Şadan, the cultural bearings of Sunni Islamic civilization haunts, and thus constitutes what's considered to be the modern and secular Turkish understanding of the psyche. One should keep in mind that Şadan's main goal in the aforementioned series of writings is to elaborate on the neurotic character and roots of important romantic love, which he analyzes in a physiological and psychoanalytical manner. For Şadan, this kind of desexualized love is a sickness in which both physiological and psychic, particularly unconscious effects, are in operation. This sickness of love has a social superstructure as well as psychic and corporeal reactions. Thus, it should be diagnosed by using scientific methodology based on causality that is used to diagnose infectious sicknesses. At this point, the complete difference between Şadan's psychoanalytic diagnosis of love and Sufi spiritual understanding and exaltation of love should be stressed. Şadan's conceptualization of love as a sickness, together with his absolute rejection of any spiritual or non-scientific rendering of it, directly targets the Sufi understanding of love, along with the Christian and romantic versions of it, and declaring it to be one of an inherited sickness in modern Turkish culture. This declaration, indeed, coincided with official government activities against the Sufi orders and institutions. the Turkish secular state's determination on dismantling all tekkes and zaviyas associated with Sufi practices in this period is well documented. This official anti-Sufism policy of the early Turkish Republican government seems to overlap with Şadan's views on the issue as a secular citizen, psychiatrist, and intellectual of the Republic. At the same time, Şadan was clearly participating in the production of a psychological medical discourse that complemented state's visions and actions. Concurrent with this, Şadan appears as an agent, albeit unsolicited, of early Republican Turkey, drawn by its activities while actively producing a psychoanalytic discourse that engaged the state's horizon of expectations and its vision of a progressive modern Turkish nation made up of healthy, productive Turkish subjects. In addition to that, Şadan's analysis of Christianity, and not Sunni Islam, as pathological, i.e. an outcome of Oedipus complex, hence repressive, masochistic, neurotic, is apt to be read as a response to the cultural superiority claims of the West. Thus it signifies a resistance to an all-encompassing discourse originating in Europe. What is striking about this gesture of resistance is the manner in which it constructs its arguments utilizing the rationality of positivism rather than employing local or indigenous forms of rationality. Yet Şadan still speaks within and through a Sunni Islamic cultural memory, hence produces a secular discourse predicated on an Islamic civilization that is at odds with and different from the secular Judeo-Christian culture. The power of science apparently provided Şadan a possibility to structure a different secular path informed by Sunni tradition and cultural memory to challenge the binarism of a progressive modern scientific West versus backward traditional East. Resistance to Western domination is also detectable in other writings of Şadan. A clear example is his conceptualization of a Turkish selfhood and psyche that is considerably different from the Western self and its psyche. This, however, did not mean a rejection of the idea of the individual subject. On the contrary, Şadan voiced criticisms of what he called the Turks' hostility towards individualism, especially since he considered individualism to be an essential tenet for the production of a healthy society. Again, all those layers with each other. So up to this point, we kind of had the general and sometimes quite dreadful contours of Şadan's psychoanalytic interpretation. Now it's time to kind of hear his diagnosis and prescription for the Turkish society. For Şadan, who was conscripted by the nationalist fervor of the period, the major neurosis that the Turkish individual subject was suffering from is none other than a crisis of confused identity. This confusion, or neurosis, is attributed to the longue durée millet system, a multi-communal system practiced by the Ottoman Empire that endured over many centuries and has been inherited by countless generations. What made things even worse, according to Şadan, was the futile and ineffective policies of Ottomanism. As the title of his one and only book, Lisan-ı Saadet, and you can translate it as Hallucinations of Happiness, boldly illustrates, according to Şadan, the Turkish society was suffering from hallucinations of happiness, an outcome of historically embedded neurosis within Turkish society. Şadan consequently delves into Ottoman history to trace the pathological effects of the multi-communal Ottoman system and its attempted modernization under Ottomanism on the formation of an Ottoman and later on a Turkish subjecthood. The concept of Ottomanism, emerging in the late Tanzimat period, started with the Imperial Edict of Gülhane in 1839 and culminating with another edict in 1856, introduced or instated modern citizenship and common law to multi-communal Ottoman Empire composed of different millets. and that is communities based on religious denominations, not necessarily ethnicity. To put it simply, it was an ideology emerging at a time when another new, modern ideology called nationalism was shaking the very foundations of multi-communal and multi-ethnic empires. Thus it aimed to unite different communities living within the boundaries of the Ottoman Empire under the Ottoman banner. So following this trajectory, Şadan locates the origin of what he considers to be a characteristically Turkish neurosis back to Ottomanist modernization policies, which, by undermining the notion of Turkishness, generated confusion over who is and what it means to be a Turk. Haunted by a multi-communal Ottoman past legacy and by a more recent Ottomanism that aimed to create modern Ottoman selves and citizens molded out of multi-ethnic and multicultural communities, it is only natural, according to Şadan, that Turkishness and the idea of a Turkish selfhood could only emerge as a blurred category. Moreover, Şadan traced back the neurosis of modern Turkish society and the Turkish self to what he calls the disturbed Tanzimat era that, quote, exalted the Christian elements that never played a significant role within Turkish society under the auspices of its concept of Ottomanism, unquote. This ambiguity of what constitutes a Turk and Turkish nation formed the basis of a major yet hidden neurosis within modern Turkey. This ambiguity and the neurosis it casts, Şadan thus continues, can only be overcome through an empirically well-defined Turkish nationalism. Consequently, determined to rely utterly on the scientific discourse of his own discipline to support his arguments, Şadan turns to Freud, whom he defines as a deep nationalist. Moreover, relying on, among other things, his claim of deep nationalism of Freud, relying, among other things, his claim of the deep nationalism of Freud, he comes up with a prescription for the Turkish society that constitutes the last chapter of his book, Bir Sami Saadet, and the chapter is entitled The Soul Cure, the Feeling of Nationalism. Pointing to how the concept of nation, milliyet, that is, has been unfortunately arrested previously among the Turks, Şadan once again turns to Freud, claiming that, as we have learned from Freud, the feeling of belonging to a nation does not concern solely the individual, but because of its integrative impact among the society, it works as a mechanism to cure individual neurosis. Thus, the feeling of nationality is, quote, natural for human beings and is an outcome of their narcissistic desires. Every acquisition on behalf of the individual satisfies the narcissistic nature of the individual and leads him, her, or her to happiness, unquote. According to Şadan, the anti-nationalist communities appear to be communities of suicide. In addition to that, nationalism works for the treatment of inferiority complexes. Şadan furthers his arguments by directly referring to Freud, whom he claims to underscore the necessity of indoctrinating nationalism to Jews. He nonetheless fails to offer any substantial reference to Freud's works on the subject matter. Şadan's claims on Freud's arguments for the positive impact of nationalism on individual neurosis must be mainly derived from a highly selective reading of Freud's study, Group Psychology and the Analysis of Ego, in which Freud postulates that the individual gains power and safety by association with a group, including a nation or ethnicity, at the expense of losing his or her own individual consciousness. Yet one wonders, to no avail, what could be the source for Şadan's claims on Freud's proposition of indoctrinating nationalism to Jews. Turkish nationalism, Şadan Şadan further argues, should be formalized and promulgated as a philosophical argument to protect and cure the Turkish society from social neurosis. Şadan ends his arguments through an evolutionary reading of the natural human inclinations evolving through nationalism, the sole source of happiness in a society. Since the feeling of belonging to a nation satisfies the narcissistic inclinations of the psyche, then everything opposing this inclination will divert human beings into moral and psychic anguish. Anguish is a sickness and can only be diagnosed and treated by psychiatry. And this shows to me happiness can be achieved only through nationalism. Unquote.
When was that written?
That is 1941. Since nationalism and Freud's study, which he kind of claims that he tries to indoctrinate nationalism to the Jews, was from 1921, the group psychology and analysis of the ego. So since nationalism is the sole path to happiness, then other paths, such as internationalism, anti-nationalism, socialism, the rejection of the existence of races and ethnicities, and the promotion of the idea of transcendental identities appear to be deceptions with hallucinatory effects. It is for this reason, Şadan argues, that the antagonists of racism almost always emerge from the religious, crypto-religious, mystic, Sufi cognoscenti, in other words, among the circles of pre-logic thought. And such non-logical thinking can only constitute hallucinations of happiness. Moving even further from the secularist framework based on a binaristic understanding of what is real, healthy, and what is hallucinatory and unhealthy, and ending up with the nationalist blackmail, Şadan concludes his book with the assertion that turns the possibility of standing against the idea of nationalism into rejecting the idea of Watan, the motherland. So I quote from him again: to blur the stream of nationalism is to blur the concept of the motherland, unquote. It is indeed hard not to notice the constitutive effect of the nationalist fervor of the era on Şadan's own understanding of what constitutes a healthy society, as well as his own renderings of psychoanalysis that aim to help the Turks overcome their neurosis and reach a level of mental and psychic stability. Suffice it to say that Şadan was and is often considered to be an extreme nationalist, no doubt about that, who was influenced by the ultra-nationalist circle of intellectuals of the early Republican Turkey, including figures like Nihal Atsız, Rıza Nur, and Zeki Velidi Togan. He was a regular contributor to the magazines, such as Çınaraltı, Kopuz, Toprak, and many others, published by this group in the early 1940s. Clearly, his nationalism, wrapped up with a psychoanalytic jargon, fed into and were fed up by this ultra-nationalist movement in Turkey. Şadan thus appears to be psychiatrist or psychoanalyst of that circle, bringing a diagnostic language to the social issues pertaining to nationalism as it was defined by this ultra-nationalist ideology, and that was called Turanism. That's some sort of a racist idea, ultra-nationalist and racist idea, which kind of believes the existence of a superior Turanid, that's Ural-Altay race, and it was very influential for the emergence of a number of nationalism in Eurasia, including Turkish nationalism as well as Hungarian nationalism. And this group was so drastic with their claims of nationalism, and which kind of goes in between, in many times past the line of racism. They were even targeted by the nationalist government of the Inani period in Turkey, and many members were imprisoned in 1944 with the charges of racism and treason. Treason, that work was very much involved because they were also in contact with the Nazis, and that was quite the reason for their persecution. So, in order to conclude, it's over, almost over. I should reiterate that Şadan's case displays the complex and convoluted layers of meanings and configurations of science, health, pathology, history, and society in Turkey through a historical account of the sort of psychoanalysis emerging in the early Republican Turkish context. At the same time, it discloses the kind of psychiatrist and intellectual Şadan became in Turkey by and through his engagement with Western psychoanalytic discourse and its formative disciplinary mechanisms. Focusing on Şadanian psychoanalysis, therefore, is illustrative because it sheds ample light on the interactions, correlations, and mutual constitutive effects between various different structures and discourses in early Republican Turkey, such as positivism, psychoanalysis, nationalism, secularism, and the Sunni Islamic tradition, many of which are believed to be contradictory, incompatible, and incommensurable. At the same time, this novel Turkish interpretation of psychoanalysis, as we have seen in Şadan's analytic claims on the neurosis of Christianity and the Western world, challenges the universality of Freudian psychoanalysis, as well as cultural superiority claims of the West, even though it constructs its arguments utilizing Western forms of rationality and is constituted by a secular scientific approach par excellence. Şadanian psychoanalysis, however, in contrast to a Western psychoanalytic discourse that is predicated on the Judeo-Christian liberal tradition, appears to be an outcome of the Sunni Islamic trajectory and shaped epistemologically within the context and problem spaces of early Republican Turkish culture and society.